Welcome back, and hopefully you've got some great information now from the breakout rooms. I'm way more informed on connectedness after sitting through it twice. But right now we're talking meat to metrics and how we measure meat quality, which is a topic that I'm sure as breeders is really close to your heart and something that has become really important for our industry going forward. And sitting up on the stage with me here, I have three far more learned gentlemen than myself. Craig Hickson from Progressive Meats, Daniel Brown, who was introduced earlier from Australia and the University of New England's Animal Genetics, and Neville Jopson, who has just presented on the connectedness in the last session. And so through this session, we're aiming to offer insights to the intricacies of measuring meat quality during processing, from Craig Hickson of Progressive Meat, based in the Hawke's Bay, who has utilised several different meat quality technologies. He will be followed by Daniel Brown, who we're fortunate to have with us from the University of New England's Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit, who will describe how meat quality is evaluated and used in the Sheep Genetics Australia evaluations. Following this, we'll hear from Neville Jopson of AbacusBio, who will describe how different meat quality assessments are utilised within our New Zealand genetic evaluation. So first up, we're going to have 10 minutes from each of the speakers, and then at the conclusion of that, we'll have a bit of a panel discussion for a quarter of an hour. We'll again use Slido to get questions and get into that. So first up, I'm going to invite Craig to give us 10 minutes of thoughts.
Thank you, George. Meat quality, or the word quality, I think it's often misused, but it's useful to remind ourselves that quality is in the eye of the beholder. And really it's quite fortunate it is, because this gives us an opportunity for the different attributes we have to focus on individual market segments for that. And just by way of demonstration, you might think, how many of you like to eat your steak with the juices running down your chin? Or those of you that like it like charcoal so you can use it as a filter in your biosystem. We will, of course, be judged by our consumers, not by ourselves. And this is an important factor to recall. It's not us who will determine this. And those judges will use their senses. And each of us have all got this set. So we're just actually representative of those people and those consumers. The tools they'll use are their ears. And I don't know whether you have the same Pavlovian response to the sound of meat cooking on a barbecue. I've just got to have a beer at the same time. It just doesn't feel the same without it. Sound is probably the least of the senses used, but it is part of the picture. Our eyes, pH, so dark coloured meat. So meat colour, both the lean and the fat is important. What do retail consumers buy with? How do they judge the meat? Because they can't taste it, they judge it with their eyes. And they'll base it on their perception of what they like in terms of the lean meat colour and the fat colour, the eye muscle area, the proportion of the fat to the lean. They'll make their own judgment as individuals as to what's a quality piece of meat for them, including what they can afford. And then we have our nose, or the smell. How important is this? Does it smell right before you cook it? Who does the nose test, the sniff test before you pull it out? It's been in the fridge for a while or hanging out in the killing shed. Forgot about it for a week and a half. How's it going? While it's cooking, both before and afterwards, we know we grew up with, we're quite happy with the smell of a roast leg of mutton in the oven. But there are consumers in the world who will gag on the same smell. And then we have the mouth and all of the things that go with the feel. That whole experience that goes with running through that. Now, in the first instance around quality, the major breakthrough for ourselves in an industry, the obvious one was refrigeration. And take it back to the beginning of the industry, 1882, the SS Dunedin. Refrigeration's so important. It enabled us for a perishable product to ship it and to begin exports. And that was the basis of the meat industry in New Zealand, refrigeration, and it remains just as important today. But there's been some fine-tuning. And really, when you think about refrigeration, was about, the nose, the smell, and the eyes, how it looked to try and hold it in a state that was acceptable for people and their perceptions of being a product. If you use the definition of fit for purpose in terms of the quality of it. Vacuum packaging came along, developed in the 1970s, and really came to the fore in the 80s and the 90s, in the instance of chilled product being exported and the value that came, particularly in lamb, but also in beef, and a lift in the value associated. So vacuum packaging works on extending the shelf life, and it just recognises the fact that microbial bugs that like oxygen, you just starve them of oxygen and you get a bit of a longer period of time while the meat will hold until you're ready. Of course, tenderness. And what we found with the development of refrigeration, in the early days it was a bit like your deep freeze at home, direct expansion, but then this wonderful new technology came along called blast freezing. And these blast freezers were so damn good that they could freeze a carcass within a 24-hour cycle, load to load. And then we learned this new phenomenon called cold shortening, that if you actually freeze it too fast before it's entered into rigor mortis, you can actually freeze it with the muscle fibres contracted, and it's really tough. And so the Meat Research Institute at the time came up with a process called ACNA, and then that was actually like conditioning and aging. So that was a 48-hour period and a 72 one over the weekend, where I know I was involved. I was just starting in the industry then, and I had the job of going on Monday mornings and doing the swabbing, and sometimes there was slime on the carcasses on the Monday morning at the time, and quite high bug counts, but it was all in the process of avoiding cold shortening and getting tenderness. And then they developed electrical stimulation. So that allowed us to increase the rate of onset of rigor mortis. So now it's down from 12 to 13 hours and on balance to about 1.5 hours. But you've still got to control to optimise tenderness, to control the rate of cooling to keep it in the band. And of course, with regard to the mouth, we have flavour. Now, one of the things that has happened to our great advantage in recent times is a greater acceptance, not a universal one, but a greater acceptance of the grass-fed, the grass flavours associated in I call it the grass-fed revolution. And this is particularly important in beef because this has enabled for a number of our main staking cuts to reach the table where primarily before this time it was the sole precinct of feedlot animals, and that's not our comparative advantage in New Zealand. There are a few examples of feedlots in New Zealand, but the reason that there are a few examples is because we don't compete with the cost of feed with the grain of Canada and of Australia. And so grass-fed is our place, and that's important. With regard to the flavour, then we know the flavour component associated with the fat, and so intermuscular fat came onto the scene. It's been there for some periods of time in the form of marbling and marble scoring, and particularly in beef, widespread for a long period of time. You'll be familiar with Kobe beef and such like, and the sorts of prices that goes for. So the flavour associated with the intermuscular fat, but also an influence with regard to the bite. So how does it feel when you bite it? And the implication on tenderness, succulence and juiciness. So again, about the mouth. It's about the feel. And you could go that into the eating experience. In the quality aspect, I think the next area beyond this, I'll use the word health, but in association with this, I mean it's a feeling of well-being. And this is how you feel. So this is the quality experience. So now it's talking about the experience, which is a sum of all of the parts that I mentioned above into how you feel in terms of that eating experience. And that's will be, I believe, the step beyond IMF. Now, how do you measure these things and how can you get a handle on it? Well, colour, we can do so objectively, and it is important that the tests that we use are non-destructive. So anything that involves you tasting the product is, one, too slow, too expensive, and actually means you haven't got it to sell. So you want to have a non-destructive measurement means to fit in. And in doing that, in any improvement process, I've simplified it in my mind because I can remember simple things easier in terms of the triangle that you need and picking your objective of the thing you want to improve on. You've got to involve a whole lot of people to do that and keep them informed on it, but you've got to be able to measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't get the feedback loop or provide the reinforcement for changing of behaviours and such like. And the measurement is often the most difficult aspect, and in particular if I use intermuscular fat, as an example, then the ability to measure that, yes, we can do cards and like with beef where they actually do the assessments visually. When you come to lambs, the production numbers are up and the rates, it's not really practical to do that. And so in conjunction, well, it's actually a development from Ag Research and working with Cameron Craigie, who's here today, development of a unit called a Clarispec, and we have a production model of that in our plant, which uses the hyperspectral imaging and is formed through some complicated mathematics to develop an image into an indication of the intermuscular fat. And you can use your eyes as a cross-check, and you can validate it using wet chemistry that can give you a non-destructive test. It isn't the only technology in this area, but it's one in which we're trialling and keeping an eye out on the other things. So that, I think, is probably my 10 minutes, and happy for questions.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Craig. That was a good introduction to the complexity of what we're dealing with meat eating quality, and I'd like to now focus a little bit more on how we breed for eating quality and some of the work we've done in Australia to understand how to value it and how to start selecting for it. So I'd like to quickly cover today 3 key areas. Some of that background work we've done to understand the value of lean meat yield and eating quality together, how we've implemented a system to make simultaneous improvement for both those things, and I'll just finish briefly talking about how we use it better as an industry. So to think about the history in Australia, we've, like New Zealand, for a long time had a simple breeding objective, particularly in terminal size, but we've had a focus on early growth and lean meat yield and done a really good job of making genetic improvement. But through that process, we also come to understand that was having a negative impact on eating quality, and I'll talk more about that. So we had to change tack and look more at eating quality as well. And what I see, and I think the future is in lamb and in sheep meat, is that we need to, and there's an opportunity to, transition away from lamb as a commodity product and actually valuing meat individually and rewarding for quality as well as quantity. A key part of what we've done is utilising the lambs that go through our resource flock. So we have about 2,000 lambs a year from a range of breeds across a range of sites, extensively measured and genotyped for a range of traits. And then we overlaid some eating quality work over those lambs. So we've done a lot of the standard recording that you normally do with resource flock progeny, but we also extensively studied the carcass, measuring yield as well as carcass composition and other traits. And the bit I want to focus on more today is actually the consumer testing of that. So we've got a database of something like 40,000 records for the key traits that you might be familiar with the carcass, including things like intramuscular fat, as well as shear force or the tenderness. With a subset of those lambs, we went on and done some consumer testing. So we've got about 6,000 lambs now that have been through that process from the resource flock, and we get consumers to rate their eating experience, scoring from 0 to 100, tenderness, flavour, juiciness, and overall liking. And we've done some analysis of that data from 2 cuts, the loin and the top side. So these are untrained consumers, everyday mums and dads and community. So we give them 10 random samples cooked through or prepared through a range of standard cooking methods and ask them to rank those 4 things, how well they enjoyed eating that meat. And I'm going to just quickly summarise some of the results today. So the first thing to note, don't worry about the details, except there's lots of variation for both those 2 traits and all those 4 things we asked them to score. We hear a lot from the supply chain that no one ever whinges about lamb, but when we ask consumers, there's plenty of people that are getting unsatisfactory outcomes. So the key bit we were trying to understand on top of that was how much genetic variation was there for these traits. And we can see clearly that the heritability is let's call it moderate on average across those 2, with topside actually being a little more variable and having a little bit more high heritability. So like we assumed from the shear force and the IMF, we can make genetic progress in these traits. So there's genetic variation out there for us to work with. I just wanted to summarise quickly some of the correlations between these things. Don't worry about the details, but it is interesting to note that those 4 scores that the consumers were asked to score were actually very highly correlated within cuts. So overall liking, tenderness, flavour and juiciness were all highly correlated, which is good from a selection point of view for both loin and topside. The other thing to note is that the correlations between cuts were also very highly correlated. So if we make improvement using a loin sample, we expect that to improve the eating quality of the whole carcass, which again is a good outcome from a selection point of view, because we can focus on getting samples from just one cut. It also reaffirmed some key things we did know, but it actually highlighted the strong antagonistic relationship between shear force and eating quality. So we knew this, but it was actually stronger than what we first thought. So obviously tenderness is really important. Also, we know there was a favourable relationship with IMF, and that came out nicely in those correlations. But as an industry, IMF's been our focus, I guess. But to me, it really highlights that we need to think about shear force, and getting measurements out of the supply chain for shear force isn't so easy. So that other part of the story is the correlation between shear force and IMF is only about 0.4. So they're both important for eating quality, but they're not that highly correlated themselves. So it's really important for us to keep measuring shear force somehow in our resource flocks, even if we're getting more IMF out of the supply chain. But we also need to work on ways to get more information for shear force going forward, I think. And the other bit that I mentioned at the start is that these results also highlight the antagonistic relationship with lean meat yield. So we know that we keep pushing yield, eating quality will go backwards. So it highlights to us as breeders that we need to balance eating quality and lean meat yield together. Other thing that's interesting out of this data is we ask the consumers when we do these tests how much they're willing to pay for the meat they've just eaten. And it's pretty clear across countries, different cuts and cooking methods, that the results are surprisingly consistent. And if we compare to an average product of a 3-star, people are prepared to pay half as much if it's a 2-star, whereas they're prepared to pay double if it's premium, a 5-star product. And that's quite consistent with our work in beef as well. So I think it highlights that consumers are prepared to pay for quality. So that provides an opportunity for us. On the other side of the coin, lamb's getting expensive. We want to make sure we maintain consumer satisfaction at the bottom end as well. So I now just want to briefly talk about how we've used that information and put it into our breeding values in Australia. So obviously balance is important, and we need to make sure that genetics are being bred correctly and the sheep have been managed well to get good outcomes across the whole value chain. So one thing that is quite clear is that these things are often moderately to highly related and antagonistically related. So we need good information for both traits to make good breeding decisions and make balanced progress effectively. So essentially what we've done is we've put these traits into our evaluation into our indexes, and we're trying to develop new ways to put carcass measures more cheaply or quicker early in life into the evaluation, as well as genomics being a key part of that. And we've seen recently some validation work that we've done for these traits. Genomics is really helping us now. We've got a good reference population for these hard to measure traits. So now in some of our indexes we've actually got eating quality embedded in them, and I'm going to briefly show you how much response we're making. I just wanted to highlight one example very quickly. We've recently tested the MEQ probe, where we've got chemical IMF measured, and we've used the probe as well in plant. And I won't focus on the details except to say that we've just enabled that in our routine evaluation now. So some producers are using MEQ probe out of the supply chain because the heritabilities with chemical IMF and the genetic correlation is basically not different to one. So the data is quite useful for us, and now providing a way for producers to get IMF information quickly into the evaluation and inform selection decisions earlier in life. But this has been a long journey. We started this a long time ago, over 10 years ago now, to understand these traits and work out how to use them in the breeding program. And it's only recently we started to see price signals for eating quality in the Australian marketplace. And a lot of breeders have done this essentially using goodwill and without the obvious price signals in front of them now, but they could see the need to do it for the longer term. And we've turned around the trends for IMF and shear force, and now making improvements in eating quality. We originally just wanted to maintain eating quality, but now breeders are actively chasing these traits and trying to develop value propositions. And with that, we've seen a slight decline in how much progress we're making in lean meat yield, but still making solid progress in lean meat yield at the same time by having good information available for both traits. So I think from an industry point of view, price signals for ram breeders is really important, and the longer term we want commercial producers to be rewarded for the product they're producing, and that influencing ram breeding decisions. So I've only got one slide about industry application, but I think it's the future that I see is more like beef, where we've got individual grading system. So essentially what I'd like to see is individual carcasses being graded for what sort of quality they are. And this is not just lamb in my eyes, it's sheep meat as well, because there's plenty of good older sheep that go through the system and they get devalued, in my opinion. So we're looking for ways to measure these traits, like Craig mentioned. There's a range of things we've evaluated, but our plan is to head towards an individual grading system like MSA and beef, but for lamb. So that's the future I'd like to see, and us breeding lambs to be valued properly. So I guess in conclusion, I think that eating quality generally in Australia is growing in importance, and we know that from a breeding point of view that we need good information to make balanced selection and reward breeders appropriately. Genomics has been really important and will continue to become important for these hard to measure traits. And I think feedback through the supply chain from better technology, measurement technology, informing commercial producers will drive signals for ram breeders. So I guess my take-home messages are that we are moving away from a commodity product in Australia and balancing our genetic improvement by using good information for both lean meat yield and eating quality, and working on feedback systems so that commercial producers get better information to make decisions, and also using that data to value product better throughout the supply chain. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this was the work of a large team over a lot of years. So I just wanted to thank them and all the funders of this work. Thank you.
Right, so New Zealand has had a very similar journey, I think, as our Australian currents, cousins to in our development of including meat eating quality traits in New Zealand. Some little differences in places, but what I'm going to talk about is, in just a moment, is how we're actually incorporating meat quality measurements into the New Zealand genetic evaluation. As Craig and Dan have both said, there's a lot of interest in terms of improving meat quality traits in New Zealand, particularly in intramuscular fat, where you'd have to say that just like the Australians, there has been a lot of breeder interest in spite of the fact that there isn't really a routine, industry-wide payment system in order to do that. So I was going to say that if you live long enough and work in a job long enough, you get to spend the second half of your career undoing the things that you did in the first half of your career. And I have to take a little bit of that on the chin, in that if we look at the changes that we've made, there has been, over my career, there's been a very strong focus on growth rate, on lean meat yield, and reproduction in our animals, with much less emphasis on meat quality. And as you heard from Dan, when you actually look at the impact that has, then meat quality has suffered as a result of that. We haven't necessarily been encouraged at improving the genetics of meat quality because of all the things that Craig talked about. There have been lots of things that have been put into plant in order to improve the shelf life, in order to improve the tenderness and the quality of the things. But there has been an increased emphasis in the genetics of the animals in recent years, particularly in traits like intramuscular fat, because that's something that you can't change by an intervention. It's something that the farmer has to do. We can improve shelf life or tenderness by doing electrical stimulation, but we can't add intramuscular fat. We could, but we couldn't claim that it's the wonderful product that we say it is. And so, and as you've already heard, meat quality traits are very difficult to measure and expensive. And so animals have to be slaughtered to collect samples, and those samples usually have to be destroyed, so we lose the product. We lose that, so it's not timely. It's not like a weaning weight where we can just run animals across a scale and we've got a live animal at the end of it. The initial measurements in New Zealand that we've mainly come from the South Island Genomic Calibration, where they have been targeting a number of traits. But as you'll hear, there's been a lot more growth in the area of intramuscular fat. I'm going to talk in two sections. The first one around intramuscular fat, because that's where a lot of work has been done and the widest number of measurements available, and then just a little bit on the other meat quality measurements that are available to get breeding values in New Zealand. So as I said, there's been considerable breeder interest in measuring intramuscular fat, even though there isn't a widespread payment mechanism yet. The work that has been, the excellent meat science research that's been done both in Australia and New Zealand has shown that there is benefits of having at least 3 to 4% IMF to give the eating quality benefits that people expect when they eat a lamb in terms of that experience. Craig talked about juiciness, flavour, mouthfeel, those consumer traits. And in New Zealand, the current IMF levels are around about 2.5%. So over half our product that we're doing is not up at the level, that level of getting 3% intramuscular fat. So it's kind of ironic that we're at Addington. The problem that we had was that we didn't know which horse to back, and so we've backed a whole heap of horses. The initial work that was done, the initial breeding value was around carcass marble score, where the cuts were recovered, cut open, and they was scored by humans. And so that visual score, we had a C-MARB genomic breeding value that came from those loins recovered from the SIGC project. However, there's been a lot of interest from researchers, a lot of interest from meat plants wanting to be able to measure it, interest in getting in live animal measurements. So all of these things are other measurements that are available. Wet chemistry is kind of the gold standard, but quite expensive, and you destroy the piece of meat, sending it away and extracting the fat from it. Two, scanning technologies that use different wavelengths, near-infrared spectroscopy and hyperspectral scanning, of which you've already heard about the Clarispec, Cameron Craigie's machine. There are research samples and samples collected in plants from both of those. We are interested in a live animal measurement, so CT scanning, we get a look at the loin and it's possible to see marbling in that. You heard about the MEQ probe, Dan talked about that. And there's also, we've been doing a project here on ultrasound, and I'm going to talk just very briefly about how that project is progressing. But all of these are ways that breeders are able to collect some information about intramuscular fat that goes into the genetic evaluation and produces one IMF breeding value. So these measurements are incredibly different. Marble score was just looking at our piece of meat, so we can see there's a little bit of marbling here. Wet chemistry is very good at finding it, but that's a physical measurement on the piece of meat. If we look at what the scanning, the NIR and hyperspec scanning, they produce waveforms that we get out and are able to take that and analyse and come up with a value, and the MEQ probe, which we haven't included, fits into that category. It has some flash maths that it does behind to come up with the number. And then things like CT scanning, we've got an animal here which you can see little veins of marbling in that. But we've moved into a measurement that can be taken in a live animal, so we can actually evaluate an animal that might be used as a ram. Ultrasound scanning is, in a way, you know, the pot at the end of the rainbow for us. We would love to have a machine that could come up the driveway of every farmer. It's a machine that you routinely take, use already, and that you're able to get some measurements from IMF that are useful. We're on a journey with that, so it's in grey because we're not there yet, but we have got some work ongoing in that. So the problem is we've got all of those ways of measuring it, and an analysis that doesn't like having lots of traits that we measure that we have very small numbers of measurements. And so BLG have implemented a new method that allows those measurements to be, it's using technology that the tree people use routinely in their evaluations. Trees can't move, so you can put a tree in an environment where it grows really well, or in an environment where it grows very poorly, and they can still use all that as a single trait. We've used that, so basically we treat them as if they are IMF in different environments. But there are a number of conditions that we have to meet for this to work. They have to have a really, really high genetic correlation between traits, relative to wet chemistry, which is our gold standard. And we have to know about the heritability and some information about the trait so that we can scale it appropriately so that we do end up with one trait, which is an intramuscular fat breeding value. So I won't spend much time on this one because we've already talked about them, but all of these can currently be recorded in SIL. So visual marble score, wet chemistry, NIR, hyperspec scanning and CT scanning. For ones where we have prediction equations, we also have we record the source, which we've called SRC, which records the plant that it was in and the calibration that it had in order to get that. These technologies are constantly refining their predictions, so we need to know what prediction they used in order to get that so that we might be able to adjust for that if that's needed in the future. So it is possible that an animal has more than one measurement, and at the moment we are only able to use one value. So we put them in a priority order that we've got them listed there. The original BV was CMARB, so that's the trait that we continue to use as the first one that we use. If it has a carcass marble score, we don't use a wet chemistry or a CT value if it's there. The next one down is wet chemistry because it's our gold standard. And then the other three, the order doesn't really matter because we don't have any samples where we have NIR, hyperspec and CT scanner collected on the same animal, but that's the order that we have it in. And just a note there that ultrasound and the MEQ prober aren't included at this stage. So we've gone and we've got these 5 technologies that we can do, but the way that it works, we are able to add new technologies as time goes on if they become available. And so the pathway that we've got is that we need to demonstrate to BLG satisfaction that from experimental data that we have a genetic correlation of at least 80% and hopefully higher with wet chemistry. So effectively we're saying it's the same trait, it might be expressed a little bit differently. And we've minimised the amount of data that we're prepared to accept it. It's not a large data set, but we're saying if it's going to have a high correlation, we should be able to see it with about 400 progeny from 40 sires, measured using both the new method and the wet chemistry. That's not a lot of animals for doing this kind of work, but if the genetic correlation is high, we should be able to detect it with that. In that light, I just want to talk very briefly that we have started work with the ultrasound operators that are currently offering IMF scanning to see if that we're able to bring that in, because we think that's a really valuable method to be able to add because it can be used on a very large number of animals. We have scanned CPT animals that are subsequently slaughtered and done the first year's evaluation. I'm not going to tell you the results because the data set is at the moment too small. We need to get another year's data. I just want to say that the results are are encouraging enough that it's worth doing the next year's measurement, at which point hopefully we'll know how accurate it is and how we're able to incorporate that. It will be fantastic if we can get that, but it does need standardisation because one of the operators goes from 3 to 1 and the other ones go from 1 to 3 or 1 to 5. The other meat quality traits I'm going to talk only very quickly about. They are objective traits, so they're able to be measured in plant, meat pH, colour and shear force. Most of the records that come in are currently measured by the South Island Genomic Calibration, and there are no live animal or imaging solutions currently available. So they're further down the track, but important that we do keep an eye on it. pH is quite easy to measure, sticking a pH probe in, but it's hard to automate, so it's not really, it's not there yet. There are no machines that are available commercially, but there's lots of benefits improving pH, which Craig talked about. Colour. A shot there of a very brown piece of meat in a supermarket that would be perceived as not being fresh. If you went to a 60-day aged place, you might look at that and go, that's a lovely piece of meat. But generally the consumer at a supermarket would say that's bad, so we measure the redness of meat, which is the A colour at 24 hours and have a breeding value for that. And finally, shear force is a physical measurement that simulates a person biting. It's not the same thing, so they don't correlate perfectly, but it is an objective measure. So all of those are breeding values that are currently available. 3 of them you basically have to be running animals through the South Island Genomic Calibration in order to be able to get. the breeding values for, but the index is available and breeding values are available to breeders now to be able to improve those. And I think that's it.
So we'll hook straight into some questions because there's some flowing in here quite quickly. So before they come on the screen, I've got one here, and I'm pretty sure this is for you, Craig. At the meatworks, why do we not get paid for quality carcasses instead of average price per kilo, with little quality indicators other than fecal contamination?
So they do get paid for quality, but not all of the aspects. So, for example, the size of cut is important. So that's the size of the carcass. It's leanness in terms which is represented by the GR measurement. When we go beyond that, I find that colour isn't actually an issue with lamb. Neither is pH. We just seem to be, it's very rare for us at our plants to have pH being an issue in terms of going through. But primarily the reason in terms of having the feedback is it means for the finer aspects, where, for example, intermuscular fat and or tenderness, is having a means of measuring it accurately, but more importantly, actually having a discerning consumer who you can target with it that has a value that you can reflect back in the payment mechanism on a routine basis. And that's what we're working on at the moment. But if I use intermuscular fat as an example, you saw there that the average of the population is somewhere in the 2 to 2.5 range. I think 2.5 is probably a little bit high in terms of our understanding of it. We really need to be 4+. And we have in mind a view is that we've got sufficient proportion of the population that can be there. We can actually then target that to specific areas and look to seek a premium that can be reflected in the payment.
This one's for you, Neville. You said we've been good at improving reproduction and growth, but not meat eating quality. We get paid more for heavier lambs, but no monetary incentive for eating quality. Yet when will this come into play? IMF bonus.
I think Craig. Yeah, it's a good question, and I think Craig has mentioned that in order to have a payment system, you need to be able to measure it. You need to have enough animals coming through that it's worth having it. You know, it's quite right and fair that farmers have been improving things that have improved their profitability, but there's still we compete against other proteins, and we have to offer a quality product if we're going to maintain market share. So there is some things that we need to be doing in order to make sure we're not taking, Dan said they were just trying not to make the eating quality any worse, but they've got tools to actually improve it. So the question is always, when do you respond? Do we wait for the payment system to come in and then we respond, or do you actually do something so that when a payment system does come in, you're ahead of the ball and you actually get it? So when you get paid for it, that's in the hands of meat processors, and they need a way of measuring it. But meat quality is still something that the industry needs to be thinking about and making sure we're addressing.
One here for you, Daniel. Does the Australian single-step evaluation differentiate or correct for grain versus pasture-based, or number of days of grain-fed?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't actually directly do anything about that other than adjust for carcass weight at the moment. So we have done a lot of work looking at intramuscular fat from different breeds and in different flocks, and the heritability actually is surprisingly stable, and it's quite highly heritable. So I think as an industry, we're still trying to understand the best way to, or the best commercial production system to get good expression of IMF, and people are experimenting with feeding and the like to try and get the right expression. But from a genetic point of view, we haven't had to deal with that yet, and doesn't look like we need to.
And another one, and it might come to you first, Dan. I'm not sure in Australia what the thing is. What about ram lambs and strong flavour? I had a pretty rammy tasting bite at lunch today, and I know I'm close friends with someone that does catering for a wedding, and through the years that lady has told me she just gets, as a farmer, gets so frustrated with the lamb that she sometimes buys and starts to cook it and knows immediately that it's a ram lamb. How do our international customers in Australia deal with it?
It's a good question. I don't know of any actual evidence in Australia actually trying to understand the issue, and how big an issue it is, I don't really know, but it's likely to be there, but we actually don't know much about it.
This is a common criticism, and almost every farmer would say that on preference I wouldn't need a ram lamb. We've been involved in exporting lamb cuts to North America for 35 years, in fact since 1989. And because the target was on heavier than average lambs, and they were quite a bit heavier than average in 1989 at 20 kilos, not quite so heavier now, but 80-odd% of that product is male that goes into that marketplace, and probably half of that is entire. And in all of that time, we're not aware, and I use these words carefully, we're not aware of a single complaint that's associated with ram taint. Now that might be through ignorance on behalf of the consumers in part, but we've been there a long time, a lot of people on the ground listen to a lot of people, and the flavour associated or indicated to be with ram. Now whether that's to do with the way it's processed through the works as opposed to hanging up in the killing shed, and the technology that we use in terms of the chilled vacuum packing and gas flush processing to take it through as a form of flavour stripping aspect to it, it seems to have a milder flavour on outturn than it does in the normal sense here in New Zealand. So that's why we as a company, and I know that there was one New Zealand company that did actually for a relatively short period of time say we're not going to take ram lambs anymore, but you may notice that they actually backtracked on that not that much longer after that time, but we don't see it as being a problem with our 35 years of experience in that certain marketplace.
Another one, we understand that some processing plants are installing IMF measuring tech. What technology has been installed? Neville or Craig?
Well, I think actually Neville covered the technologies that were there in the range, but it's really got to be when I say it's not non-invasive, but it's one that doesn't actually consume or damage the product. So you saw the MEQ probe. I'm aware of at least 2 installations in New Zealand. One of them is in our plant. There may be more. And the infrared, I'm not clear on whether there's any near-infrared installations, but there is the hyperspectral Clarispec also in our plant in Hastings. And there's another technology which I think is also around scanning in one of our other plants in Fielding. So there's let's say people are testing different aspects, looking for something that will work and have it validated, because we've got to make sure that when we have a reading that it's accurate, because to follow on the earlier inference around when we'll be paid for it, you can be paid for it and you will be paid for it when it can be measured accurately with confidence, so that we can return and we can use that confidence to market that product specifically to certain segments at a premium price that can be reflected. So I've seen that the confidence in the measurement system on an online measurement system has been the hurdle to jump for some years now, but we're getting closer, but it's still in progress. We've been involved for 2 or 3 years with beef and lamb genetics and a progeny trial testing at our Hastings facility, and then beef and lamb withdrew, and we carried on for another 5 years. And we've only just run through the last cohort, went through in February of this year, and we could notice a consistent outturn during that period of time where those, I'll call it maternal sires, have ranked very well as a generality in comparison to terminal, which I think was already alluded to by my learned friends here with regard to the focus on lean meat yield exclusively without as being detrimental with regard to intermuscular fat. And it seems logical to me that when you're breeding for maternal characteristics you require to be able to raise the lamb, that having those fat deposits is really helpful.
Okay, we'll wrap it up there. So just thanks very much to Craig, Daniel and Neville for your insights, and I'm sure they're going to be around this afternoon and most likely this evening if you want to chat to them more. So thank you.